Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy.
Welcome again to another episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. And this is the fourth in our slightly longer series with my two esteemed colleagues with significantly more experience, but not that much to make them old, than I've got in this field, Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod. And this is the fourth one that we're trying to think of a question that we just have a free-flowing conversation on. And this week's question is, what are practices for leaders that free them from the usual way of thinking and the usual way of doing? And I love this question because my immediate thought was actually something from one of Judy's books, which is the idea of cone in the box. And it's something I've used a lot. And I tried to get somebody to build me one at one point. But if there was a cone in the box and there was a peephole in the side and another peephole in the top, and two different people looked in the box at the same shape, one might see a triangle and one might see a circle, and they'd be absolutely certain of the shape that they were seeing, but then would only open their minds when they thought about how you combine the two, and it could be a cone in the box. And that's always been something I've used to get people to let go of their locked in way of thinking and start exploring the idea that it might be this is true and something else can be true at the same time. So that was my immediate thought when I saw this question, Judy. Tell us more about cone in the box.
Well, what strikes me about that example of cone in the box is it requires some disciplines on the part of whoever is shaping the dialogue or conversation. One is when you say to somebody who's looking from the top down at that point and seeing a circle, is to say, what do you see? And if they say it's a circle, say that's not the question I asked. The question I asked is, what do you see? Because as soon as they're focused on it's a circle, and the people looking in at the side who are seeing a triangle are focused on it's a triangle, you have no chance for stretching people's thinking. All you've got is a debate, an argument, whatever. So as a leader, one of the challenges is helping people use their minds in a much more flexible way, so they get used to saying, what I am observing here is this. And people learn to say to each other, do you see it all the time? Is it always like that? Have you always been able to see that? Do you have special training that allows you to perceive that in a particular way, so that bit by bit, you're able to form something that has more dimensions than any one of you or any few of you can see? The bottom line of that story is the guy from the organization that taught it to me said, let me explain to you why it's important to be able to take in completely different points of view. It's the Center for Creative Leadership. And he said it explains why this quality of conversation is important. And then he said it also explains why airplanes crash. And airplanes crash because somebody has seen something and they maybe spoke up and they got put down about it, or they maybe didn't speak up, or maybe they were shy, or maybe they didn't think they were expert enough to be speaking up. And so what could have averted a crash or an organizational crash, if you want to use that example, is lost in the organization that can only hear some people, is only willing to see certain points of view as legitimate, only believes the captain. Sometimes the captain doesn't see it. Sometimes it's a passenger. So to begin to be able to hold the thought that which I am proving right now, my tendency to talk over somebody puts our lives at risk. And so does my tendency to be a small town Midwesterner and not be sure of myself. Both of those stances are dangerous for our organization and its survival.
Yeah, my understanding is NASA has some new rules post the Challenger disaster about listening to the small voices, because there
Whoa.
were people that weren't heard and weren't listened to that had valuable data
Yes.
that was dismissed and talked over. So then, I mean, that this cone in the box has always been my go-to tool for getting people to free themselves from their usual ways of thinking and the usual ways of doing. What else have you seen and used that help leaders do that?
This feels unusual. I'm going to use a poem to get at that notion.
Those that have listened to this podcast and episodes that you've been on will not see that as unusual. But so that's a good thing. I think you're 4 for 4 at the moment, but that's good.
All right. So this one is actually not mine. It's by Robert Bly, Minnesota poet. And it's about the way in which we are captive of old thinking. But it's so rude that it's unforgettable. So it sort of stays with people. It's called One Source of Bad Information. And let me get to the bottom line. The source of bad information is the thinking that's going around in our head. But this is what Bly says. There's a boy in you about 3 years old who hasn't learned a thing for 30,000 years. Sometimes it's a girl. This child had to make up its mind how to save you from death. He said things like, stay home, avoid elevators, and eat only elk. You live with this child, but you don't know it. You're in the office, yes, but you live with this boy at night. He's uninformed, but he does want to save your life, and he has. Because of this boy, you survived a lot. He's got 6 big ideas, 5 don't work, and right now he's repeating them to you. So this sorting out of what are these ideas left over that are as out of tune with life as eat only elk, that are still buzzing around in our head and driving the minivan or whatever we're driving, that takes really, it takes sitting with yourself and listening to that process and saying to yourself, wait just a minute. Am I sure that's true? You know, does that really work? Is that working for us? Is it working for me? That takes a lot of discipline.
I'm struck to 2 things coming to my mind. One is that old line about hardest thing to change is your mind.
Right.
And Peter Senge talked about 3 levels of work. A level being the work we do on our sort of the stuff, the what. B level work is stuff we do on the how, and C level work is on the work we do with why. And I think leaders, what you've said, if I translate it slightly differently, is given this uncertain future, and I love the term we've used before, blundering into the future. Very powerful context. Within blundering into the future, how do we need to think differently and do differently? I think it strikes me that the thinking part comes first, and Peter Senge's C-level work, which is the ability to think about how we think about things, becomes more and more important, particularly in our leaders. That their ability to think about how they think about things, and all of us having the capacity to do that, taking the time to do that when we're stressed out of our brains, is a real challenge.
Judy?
That brings back a conversation actually I had with Peter. He always called these things mental models. And I used to think, why in the world can he just use plain English and say something like, this is the way we think? So I was back and forth with him about it. And he said, I use that term because we understand the difference between a model airplane and a real airplane, that this is not that. The model airplane is just a representation. It's just a model. It's not the real thing. He said we need some kind of language that helps us understand the same thing about our thinking. It is not reality. It is a model we're creating of reality, and then we're operating, we're doing as if it's so. And we're so fixed in it that we don't see the information coming in that says this isn't working very well, because we're wedded to it. I think this, therefore I am. And so helping people loosen their hold on things. I used to work with one leader who would come into a meeting. He was the CEO, and he would say, all right, so we've got to decide how to move ahead here. He said, I want to lay out for you the assumptions I'm making. He said, I want you to just absolutely take those on, because they may be wrong assumptions, and I've been wrong before. So we've got to collectively pull these things apart and decide what really are mental models that we can live with, what really are assumptions that track with the world as it is now. That takes a lot of courage to operate that way.
It's kind of interesting, having lived through the last 2 years, that if you think back how many companies that I work with in 2020, of January 2020, said you cannot work from home. And then by April 2020, had up to 100% of their workforce working from home. And it's interesting to me, even at the other end, where I'm seeing both now, where some people are saying, we're taking advantage of this working from home, and anybody can work from home, keep doing it. And then other companies are saying, okay, pandemic's over, back to the office, back to the old model, and immediately losing people because they got used to working from home, and it's a different kind of quality to that, and look after kids and things that are going on at the same time. But that's an example of people going straight back to the old mental model, even though we've broken it.
Yeah. I had this funny image in my mind of, if we say the ability to do, I think it's Edgar Schein calls double loop learning. Think about how, it's basically thinking about how we think about things, right? Don't just go cause and effect, go cause, effect, what led us to do cause, double loop learning. I was thinking, can you imagine an interview for employment that would go like this? So tell me, how good are you at thinking about how you think about things, and tell me a story about a time when you did that. We did, and yet that may be one of the most important capacities we're going to need in our organizations going forward.
Yeah. So how do we help people do that?
And how do we help people realize that resilience is not about springing back? Resilience is about making choices for how to move forward in the world as it has evolved in front of us. And I think we've been so wedded to it'll be so wonderful when we can go back to normal. We need to go forward to normal. Right. And it's so hard to break that kind of mold of thinking in our mind. Even when we've had the experience of something that we said absolutely couldn't happen, that could not be possible. We still want to break it and go back to the old way.
Yeah, you're making me laugh a little bit there, because I think you both know I got promoted to grandfather last year, and so I've got daughter living next door but one, and it's funny how many times my wife and I hear ourselves saying, well, I don't know how you survived, because our daughter is doing all these things with our granddaughter that are different to how we did it. And she threw back in our face a couple of weeks ago, you're talking about survivor's bias. And It was like, oh yeah, I guess we are. And there's more information has come on since the 30 years ago when you were born, that, so we have to pay attention to that.
Well, and there's a wonderful question that goes along with that when you're tempted to say, to wade in with your point of view about how it should be done. And that is, did they ask you?
What are you saying, Judy? Just make sure my daughter doesn't listen to this podcast.
Right. I think part of what we're talking, for me, what we're talking about in a way is a natural human inclination to search for certainty. And if there was something I would offer to leaders now about how you think differently and do differently, I think I would start with lighten up on a search for certainty. It's a whole stance in the world in relationship to the world that just doesn't work anymore. How do we change our minds, and what would be the change in doing if we lightened up on a search for certainty? Here's a couple of examples that come to mind. That search for certainty, we see it in team, when groups, teams come together to do problem solving. Everybody walks in the room certain that they have the right answer. And they fight like crazy to have their right answer selected as the thing we'll do, right? And so you almost always leave the room in disharmony and disarray. What if we changed our mind how we thought about that and said to ourselves, there is no right answer. And if there is, we won't know for 3 years. What if we said to ourselves, the right answer is the one we choose? And that's going to create harmony. It's going to create coherence. It's going to create everybody working together because we have said this is the quote unquote right answer. For leaders, you hear this, the version for leaders individually is you hear people saying more and more and more, and I do in the companies that have the smartest people in the world in them, I feel like an imposter. What does that mean? It usually means they're uncertain and they think they should be certain and that they're acting like they're certain. So they feel like an imposter. Can you imagine? You got hired at the company with the smartest people in the world and you're all feeling like imposters because we confabulate certainty with confidence. So what if at the end of the day, leaders understood this? If there is no certainty, yeah, there's some times when there's certainty, but a lot of times there's not. If there's no obvious right answer, it's the one you choose. And at the end of the day, all you can give them is your best thinking. What else you got?
I love that because it both fits with some of the work I've been doing around imposter syndrome and why it connects there. But it also made me make the leap into kind of lean manufacturing and the Toyota way, because it's best practice until it's not best practice. And then the new best practice is best practice. And that is showing a lack of certainty. I'm saying this is best practice right now, and we're going to keep exploring. And the moment we find out a new best practice, a better practice, we'll make that the best practice.
And the best practice is a consequence of our best thinking. I'm giving you my best thinking. I mean, I've tried. It's not just here's a kind of empty thing to hang your hat on. It's the reality. At the end of the day, what you have is your best thinking. That's what you owe them and everything that comes before that. And like at Toyota, well, that was our best thinking, and out of that came our best doing, and we got to think differently now and do differently. So this notion that there's certainty out there, I think, is a part of what we have to abandon as leaders and as individuals and learn as we go, so to speak. Give them your best thinking. That's what you can do. That's not an imposter.
Which is kind of, if I go back to the cone in the box idea, my best thinking right now is that's a triangle, but I'm open to other perspectives. And when I get other perspectives, my best thinking may change.
Yeah.
Judy, I see you're taking copious notes there, so you've obviously got some thoughts.
Post-its. I was struck by the idea of certainty not being possible, turning toward best thinking, and that gives us confidence. And the confidence to move in that dynamic gives us competence, but the competence may be temporary because we're going to learn something through that process that then makes us realize that some of the things that we thought we knew for sure, we didn't. So the notion that that confidence is entirely possible if we're watching our thinking and our doing as if it were weather rather than a stone wall. That this is evolving, it's changing with seasons, it's not what we expect. We can predict it a ways into the future, and that's about all we can do.
I think I told this story, but it may be worth telling again. It illustrates what we're talking about. And it comes from a friend of mine who was working with a CEO, and the CEO told a story. Here's the power of story. That a bunch of MBA students came and visited and said, one of the questions they said is, how do you stand it where every decision you make could sink this company? And his response was really startling. He said, yeah, it's really true. And the way I deal with that is to not try and kill myself thinking that I could ever make a decision that wouldn't hurt this company, or that I could kill the company and we could all die. The way I approach it is to say, of all the ditches I can die in, which one do I want to die in? And that does two things. It's a way of saying, this is my best thinking, it's all I got. And it's a way to get away from the anxiety of dying and focus on what we need to do because we've made a decision that this is our best thinking and we're going to act on it.
It's the anxiety of making a mistake. It doesn't need to be big enough to kill the company. It's the thing that keeps us from being willing to move forward in the face of uncertainty. And so, and it scales all the way up. So if we don't create in our organizations a dynamic where it's all right to make a mistake, in general, it's called learning, then everybody's going to hold back and not be able to move, or they're all going to turn to the leader and expect the leader to eliminate the uncertainty. And when she or he doesn't, they're going to shoot the leader.
Yes.
So,
resent them for not taking away their anxiety.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, what you're talking about there, though, is a cultural aspect, isn't it? That if we create a culture of certainty, then people never want to make a decision and there's anxiety. If we create a culture where people are encouraged to make the best decision with the information that they have and are supported and backed for making that, even if it costs the company, then it's a matter of, hey, it cost the company because you didn't have this information and that was my fault that you didn't have that information. You made the best decision based on the information you had. I'm going to support you with that and let's learn and grow from it.
Yeah,
That's a leadership act that creates the culture where people feel less anxious about making those decisions.
I think I want to try something here that struck me that is kind of in and around what we're saying. If people are going to make this shift, hardest thing to change is your mind, et cetera. We're really talking about the capacity of people in the organization for learning and development. The ability to think differently and do differently, which is both learning and development. My line is learning's easy, development sucks. I'm all for development, yours. Mine is really painful. But, part of what we're saying that maybe an imperative for leaders and in turn the company is this notion of investing in your own development. We can't outgrow the leader. I mean, all of us can remember stories about where we want to do this, we want to try and do that. And somebody would say, we can't do that because the leader can't stand it. So this notion about, for me, the notion is, yeah, the organization can tolerate as much discomfort as the leader can stand. And so the ability of the leader to invest in their own development becomes a business, the development of leader as a human being becomes a business issue. They can't outgrow you.
Which then, the value of investing in your own development is really talking about expanding your thinking, which then cycles back to what you're talking about. The more I expand my thinking, the more I see things differently. I have more comfort with uncertainty. I've always thought one of the best things for expanding your thinking is travel, especially travel to different places than where you grew up. The more different, the better, because it actually challenges you to step out of the way that you normally operate. And my biggest experience was being in Vietnam, and crossing the road in Vietnam is very different to crossing the road in the UK or North America, where you would look for a gap and dash over here. That's the worst possible thing you can do. There's 1,000 motorcycles going around the roundabout at the same time. What you have to do is to step out into the traffic slowly and keep moving. And the traffic will just fold around you. And it's one of the most bizarre shifts in thinking that I've ever come across, because I was stood on the side of on the sidewalk waiting for the gap to run, and I could have caused a major incident if I had done that. And if it hadn't been for my wife having experienced it earlier in the day and saying, no, take my hand, walk slowly and keep moving. And it was that break, that shift of thinking, because I'm experiencing a very different environment. And what you're talking there is the more I invest in my development, my growth, the more I'm likely to be able to see things differently.
Exactly. And here's the part that makes it difficult. There's a line about development begins at the boundary of discomfort. Well, a whole bunch of research from Center for Creative Leadership says exactly that. We learn in the crucible. So the very things we would do anything to avoid, travel, what we encounter in travel, those very things that we would do anything to avoid are the things that will grow us. So and then it's our ability to stick our nose where it really doesn't want to go. That becomes the leadership imperative.
So we're asking this question about what practices will help leaders break this thinking. We're talking, one of them being, look at our mental models, challenge them, look inwards, explore different things, invest in your development. What else can leaders do when, especially as we're emerging out of this challenging situation into another challenging situation? At the moment, things are going to be different as we move forward, as Judy says. What else can we be doing to really get us to think differently?
You have to surround yourself with people who just come from entirely different frameworks, however you can do that, and dig in pretty deeply about how it is and why it is they see things the way they do, and realize it's going to slow the process down. And we have this idea that we somehow have to keep things moving quickly. And so it's going to challenge, it's almost like you're entering the traffic in Vietnam. It's going to change your sense of how things move. If you can draw enough in terms of partnerships and staff around you who are going to slow things down, so you really examine your thinking, and so that you consider installing some new thinking along the way. So it's not going to feel productive. Like almost everything that we've offered in the conversations we've had, it's not going to look like our usual view of productivity.
Because you're talking about, we're going to slow things down. We're going to surround ourselves with people who think differently to slow things down, to come up with a better solution.
You got it.
And it's the belief that that better solution will actually jumpstart us into a better future than the one if we hadn't have slowed things down.
Yes, and we aren't going to be cleaning up the messes that would be left from heading forward on what is a really stupid path, a silly path, whatever we want to call it. That's now our view of productivity is we wait until we've got it all figured out, and then we move ahead, and it doesn't go the way we plan, and we have a mess and we clean it up. But we do a lot better to invest in a lot of points of view and run some small experiments, or run an experiment for a while and see what we learn from it.
So surround yourself with people who would think differently, expand your thinking, create the space and the time to actually allow for that experimentation and that looking for best practice for the best thinking. Rick?
Yeah, what strikes me, David, is there's a number of sort of specifics we've talked about that can happen. I think for the leader, it goes back to the old-fashioned model the behaviors, model the emotions, model the thinking, thought process, model the worldview that you want people to adopt for themselves. You got to go first. You got to go first. And if part of what you're modeling is, I'm going to stick my nose in my development and everything that entails, whether it's doing something different or thinking differently, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do it reasonably publicly, that I'm modeling those behaviors, and indirectly, or maybe even directly, the message to the organization is, we will live or die based on our ability to change, learn, grow, develop. It's not going to be easy. It's a requirement. I'm going first. Guess who's next?
Yeah, I think that's, some of the best leaders I've worked with seem to be voracious readers. They're constantly in that personal development, that looking for that next opportunity, that next change of thinking. And that goes with what you're saying, is that the more I'm doing that, the more I'm looking for that space. And something you mentioned there reminded me, if I go back about 15 years to a plant, somebody I worked with there that Judy knows as well. We'll call him Dan because that's his name. But he went into a plant that was struggling on every metric against its sister plants. And the first thing he did was say, we're going to have an offsite with a leadership team for the day. And everybody resisted this and said, why are we doing that? It's obvious by the numbers, we need to be at work doing more work. And that choice to say, no, we're going to go offsite. The plant will run, we'll make some parts. Some of them might be crappy, but we're going to take the time to be offsite, to stop and think about this. That's the kind of thinking you're talking about.
Yeah. Here's one I use sometimes when I think about, how we naturally want to fall back on the notion that the authority figure has all the answers. And when you do that, and when you reinforce that, essentially you truncate not only their development, but your own. So one of the things I think a leader might try and do, because it will catalyze their own development, because their anxiety will go up, is the next time somebody comes into your office and says, oh my God, the sky is falling, I don't know what to do. What do I do? Here's a response. Thank you for telling me. Anything else?
Lyndon Johnson used to greet that sort of thing over his glasses like this, and he would say, so?
Exactly.
That was his response.
And that's the epitome of the calm hand on the tiller, isn't it? That no matter what's going on in your head, what people want is that calmness. And it goes back to my guy Dan that would say, no, we're going offsite. I know this is the right thing. We're going to stop and we're going to create space for us to get our best thinking together. And 6 months later, all their numbers had changed. They flipped, and people were saying, when's the next offsite? Which was a mind shift, but you had to kind of force them there to start off with, kicking and screaming in some cases, in order to create that space. And that's, it can be scary, that anxiety for the leader to say, I believe this is the right thing and I'm going to do this, even though there's pressure against it because everybody else wants to keep running. I'm going to stop the race for a minute and make sure we're running the right race. And
why would they be so reluctant about the offsite? Because they know how to make the parts and they know how to work on the floor. But if they go to the offsite, they might have to be in an emotional space. They might have to be in an uncertain space. They might find themselves feeling kind of lost and not knowing how to do it. I mean, all of the kinds of resistances that come up because it's unfamiliar. Yeah. And all of us wanting to flee toward the thing that we already know how to do.
And it's uncomfortable. And if I can't stand as a leader their discomfort, I will back off of what I know needs to be done. So they will tolerate as much discomfort as I can stand. My job is to be able to stand discomfort in the service of development.
And even that's interesting. I've done a number of offsites with this Dan character since then, and at different companies. And we'll always start the first one by saying, you probably don't want to be here. You probably think there's 1,000 other things. And I can tell you by about the 6th one of these, you're going to say, why didn't we have more of those? And so you can predict that for people, and you can start to reduce the anxiety and tell them what's going to be happening, what's going on through their mind, so that then they start to settle and say, oh, these people have done this before, and I can relax a bit. And then you engage their creativity, which then takes us to the next level.
You know, part of it is just helping people have language for it. I mean, the discomfort language, I find, which is new to me, is enormously powerful. Just giving people that language so that when they feel it, they go, oh, that's what that is. That's the edge of my development. Oh, that's what that is. It's not that you're in the wrong place. You're absolutely in the right place, but it's not familiar. And you would, if you could, run from the room.
So expand on that discomfort language a little bit, Judy. What else would you characterize as discomfort language? Is it just being able to label my uncomfortableness?
Yeah, it's having, we have all these things we tell each other. People resist change. You know, there are all these kinds of rules for how the world is. And to simply insert a different rule, okay? To say it's natural to be unsettled by what's going on in the world around us. All right, that's normal. It's natural when we're stepping away from the way we know how to do things toward, we're not even in it yet, toward new ways, to find that really unsettling. Mm-hmm. So language like unsettled, uncomfort, discomfort, things that people, I think of them as kind of handholds. They go, oh, that's right. That's the language, at least, I get. Now I know where I am because that language fits my emotions. So I know I'm in the right place.
We've actually used the stages of grief for that, for change. And the abbreviated version, we call it SARA, which is the same. And if you put it out in front of people, there's shock, anger, rationalization, and then acceptance, and say, hey, you're going to go through this. It's part of a process. We understand it. Just recognize where you are and recognize that you're not there yet.
It's a normalization of discomfort.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
You know, well, I'm really uncomfortable. Right. Seems appropriate to me at this time. We would be. Let's keep going. It's changing the nature of the relationship to discomfort.
I think that, especially as we were talking about with the current times, the constant rapids, that labeling, yep, it's going to be uncomfortable. Yep, let go of the need for certainty. Let's put our best thinking in the bucket, and whatever we come out with is going to be the best thinking, because we'll label it that way.
Yeah.
If we start to frame things that way, we start to move people forward rather than tread water or spin our wheels.
Which reminds me, before we leave, can I make a request, which is to please ask Judy to read her poem, Trough, at some point before we sign off, because you just used that imagery and that metaphor, and I think her poem is perfect.
I'm trying to remember whether we used that one in a previous episode or not. I think we might have done, but it's always a good sign off, and I do enjoy a good Judy poem. So, I mean, there's a few things that we've talked about today that let go of the need for certainty. The hardest thing to change is a mind. The value of investing in your own development, expanding thinking, creating a team that thinks differently to you and engaging them. One of the best quotes I ever heard was that people don't mind change. What people mind is being changed. And so the more they're engaged in that process, and then also acknowledging, as we've talked about, the fact that it is going to have a level of discomfort with it. And let's talk through that rather than resisting it or not acknowledging it. So sounds like a good place to stop. And as requested, we will close on a Judy Brown poem. I'm sure you've got it at your side somewhere there.
I'm ready. This is a poem about how to be in really uncomfortable circumstances, in scary circumstances, which is what I think many people are experiencing these days. And it actually was generated in me by a circumstance on Lake Michigan where a boat went down, burned to the water line. One person was lost, one person made it to safety. There's a trough in waves, a low spot where horizon disappears. And that's our problem. The horizon has disappeared on us. Whoa. And only sky and water are our company. And there we lose our way unless we rest, knowing the wave will bring us to its crest again. There we may drown if we let fear hold us in its grip and shake us side to side and leave us flailing, torn, disoriented. But if we rest there in the trough, in silence, being in the low part of the wave, keeping our energy and noticing the shape of things, the flow, then time alone, and I want to underline that. I used to think it meant then time by itself. It also means then time alone for the leader, time alone for people to begin to take in the circumstances. Then time alone will bring us to another place where we can see horizon, see the land again, regain our sense of where we are and where we need to swim.
Thank you, Judy. Just, I forgot to do this last time. Tell us where people can find that poem.
That poem is in A Leader's Guide to Reflective Practice.
Smashing. Highly encourage it. Judy Brown, Rick Eigenbrod, thanks very much for another rich conversation. I look forward to catching up with you next time.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.